The saloon doors of Redemption Gulch swung open, but it was the silence that followed, not the sound, that made Silas Blackwood look up from his whiskey. The midday sun blazed outside, framing the silhouette of a woman who had no business being there. She was small, and as her eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw the worn-through fatigue in her posture. She wore a light pink prairie dress, the color of a faded sunset, but it was tattered at the hem and stained with the dust of a long, hard road. What struck him most, however, was the resolute set of her jaw. She was not there by mistake. She was Chinese, a widow by the look of her, and in Nevada in 1878, that made her presence in the Lucky Spade Saloon an act of either desperation or profound ignorance. The low murmur of conversation died instantly. Cards stopped shuffling. The piano player's hands hovered over the keys, a chord left unfinished in the stale, beer-soaked air. Every eye in the room fixed on her. She ignored them all, her gaze directed at the burly man wiping a glass behind the bar. She moved with a quiet dignity that seemed out of place against the backdrop of rough-hewn wood and spittoons. Her steps were deliberate as she approached the bar, stopping a respectable distance away. "Please, sir," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying a slight accent that made the word sound carefully chosen. "I am looking for work. Any kind. I can clean, I can cook, I can mend." The bartender, a man named Henderson with a face like a sour dishcloth, let out a short, ugly laugh. "Work," he scoffed, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Lady, look around. Does this look like a sewing circle to you?" A few men snickered. The woman, Wei, did not flinch. Her gaze remained steady. "I am a hard worker. I do not ask for much. Just enough for food and a place to stay." Before Henderson could deliver another insult, a heavy hand landed on the bar. Sheriff Brody pushed himself away from his corner table, his bulk casting a long shadow. Brody was a man who enjoyed the authority his star afforded him, especially when the object of that authority couldn't fight back. His face was flushed with whiskey and self-importance. "All right, that's enough of that," he boomed, his voice a gravelly announcement. "We got laws in this town. No vagrancy. And no soliciting in a place of business." He turned his dismissive eyes on Wei. "You need to move along. Now." "I am not begging," Wei stated, her chin lifting a fraction. "I am asking for honest work. And I'm telling you there's none for you here," Brody snarled, his patience, always a shallow commodity, evaporating completely. He rounded the bar and grabbed her by the upper arm. Her small frame was swallowed by his meaty hand. "Let's go." She stumbled, trying to keep her footing as he began to haul her toward the door. It was the sight of her bare feet in worn-out slippers, scraping against the filthy floorboards, that finally made something shift in Silas Blackwood's chest. He had been a passive observer, a man nursing a drink and his own quiet troubles, content to let the world spin on without his interference. He had seen ugliness before. The frontier was full of it. A man learned to look away, to mind his own claim and let other folks mind theirs. But the sheriff's casual cruelty, the way he handled her like a sack of unwanted grain, grated against a principle buried deep within him. He watched Brody shove her through the swinging doors, her slight form disappearing into the blinding glare of the street. She didn't cry out, but a small gasp of pain was swallowed by the creak of the doors. Brody dusted off his hands with a look of profound satisfaction, as if he'd just tidied up a mess. The saloon began to breathe again. The piano player tentatively struck a note. Men picked up their cards. But the silence had changed something. It was heavier now, tinged with a shared, unspoken shame. Silas looked down at his glass, at the amber liquid he'd been using to numb the loneliness of his small homestead. He thought of his own mother, a woman who had faced the world with that same quiet resilience. Then he thought of nothing at all. He just moved. He pushed his chair back, the sound scraping across the wood floor, loud and deliberate. Every head turned his way. He dropped a few coins on the bar to cover his drink and walked toward the doors. He didn't look at Brody. He didn't look at anyone. He just walked out into the oppressive summer heat. and Wei was on her hands and knees in the thick dust of the main street, gathering a few meager possessions that had spilled from a small cloth bundle, a comb, a small, folded piece of paper, and a tiny, carved wooden bird. Sheriff Brody stood over her, arms crossed, a smug sentinel of civic order. "I told you to get out of town," Brody was saying. Silas stepped past him without a word and knelt beside Wei. He picked up the wooden bird, its surface worn smooth with handling, and placed it gently in her palm. He offered her his other hand. She looked up at him, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and surprise. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her small, calloused hand in his, and he helped her to her feet. He turned to face the sheriff. The sun was hot on the back of his neck. He could feel the eyes of the entire saloon on them, watching from the doorway and the windows. "Sheriff," Silas said, his voice low and even, devoid of any heat. That was unbecoming of a man with a badge. Brody's face darkened, the smugness curdling into rage. "This ain't your business, cowboy. This is town business. She's a vagrant." "She was asking for work," Silas corrected him calmly. "I heard her." "Well, there's no work for her kind here," Brody spat, taking a half step forward, his hand drifting instinctively toward the Colt on his hip. "So unless you plan on hiring her yourself, I suggest you get back to your drink and let me do my job." The challenge hung in the air, thick as the dust. It was a bluff. Brody expected him to back down, to melt back into the anonymity from which he'd come. Silas could feel Wei's slight weight behind him, her presence a silent question. He could walk away. It was the smart thing to do. The safe thing. He had a small claim to work, a life to build. He didn't need this trouble. But the image of her on her knees in the dirt, of the sheriff's satisfied smirk, had already made the decision for him. "All right," Silas said, meeting Brody's glare without wavering. "I will." The sheriff blinked, caught off guard. "You'll what?" "I'll hire her," Silas said, the lie forming as he spoke it. "I've got a homestead claim north of here. Needs work. Fences to mend, a cabin to keep. I'll pay her a fair wage." He looked at Wei. "If she'll have the job." Wei stared at him, her expression unreadable. She gave a single, sharp nod. Brody was cornered, and he knew it. He couldn't arrest a woman who had just been offered legitimate employment. To do so would be a gross overreach of his authority, even in a town as loose with the law as Redemption Gulch. His face twisted with frustration. "You're making a mistake, Drifter," he snarled, pointing a thick finger at Silas. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," Silas replied, turning his back on the sheriff. "But that'll be my business, not yours." He gestured for Wei to walk with him toward the livery stable where his horse was tied. "Come on, let's get you away from all this." As they walked, the whispers from the saloon followed them like flies. Silas didn't have a plan. He had a one-room cabin, a stubborn patch of land he was trying to prove up on, and just enough money for supplies to last the month. He had acted on an impulse, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to honor in a long time. He did not yet know that the sheriff was the least of the dangers he had just invited into his life. The ride to his claim was mostly silent. Wei sat behind him on his steady mare, her hands resting lightly on his hips. He could feel the tension in her small frame. His homestead was nothing more than a clapboard shack and a half-finished corral, nestled in a small, arid valley shadowed by granite hills. It was a lonely place, and seeing it through a stranger's eyes made it seem even more pathetic. "It's not much," he said, dismounting and helping her down. "But it's dry, and it's safe." She looked around, her gaze taking in the endless blue sky, the dusty ground, the stark emptiness of it all. "It is enough," she said quietly. He showed her the small lean-to he'd built against the side of the cabin, which served as his sleeping quarters. "You can have the cabin," he told her. "I'm used to sleeping out here." For the next few days, an awkward truce settled between them. Wei was a tireless worker. She cleaned the cabin until the rough floorboard shone, mended his shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, and cooked meals from his meager supplies that tasted better than anything he'd eaten in years. She spoke little, but her presence filled the silence of the valley. Silas found himself working harder, too, driven by a new sense of purpose. He finished the corral and started digging a new well, the rhythmic thud of his pickaxe a steady beat against the quiet landscape. When he rode into town for supplies a week later, the chill was palpable. Henderson at the saloon wouldn't serve him. At the general store, the owner, Mr. Gable, served him, but his words were clipped and his eyes were cold. "You're making powerful people uncomfortable, son," Gable said as he weighed out a sack of flour. "All I did was hire a woman who needed a job," Silas replied, keeping his voice even. Gable leaned forward, lowering his voice. "It's not about her. It's about who she is. Her husband, Phone, he worked for the Railroad Survey. He died in a cave-in up at the Sterling mine last spring. At least, that's the story." He paused, looking toward the door as if expecting to be overheard. "You keep her around, you're inviting trouble from Mr. Sterling. And Jedediah Sterling is not a man you want trouble with." The name hung in the air. Jedediah Sterling owned the most prosperous silver mine in the territory. He owned the bank, held the mortgage on half the businesses in town, and it was widely understood that Sheriff Brody kept his job only so long as it pleased Mr. Sterling. Silas paid for his supplies and left, a cold knot forming in his stomach. This was bigger than a cruel sheriff. This was about money and power. When he returned to the claim, the knot tightened into ice. During the night, while they slept, someone had come. A 20-foot section of his new corral fence was cut clean through, the posts kicked over. His only water barrel had been tipped, its precious content soaked into the thirsty ground. It was a clear, unmistakable warning. He expected Anway to be frightened, to finally see the futility of her situation. Instead, he found her by the broken fence, a length of discarded baling wire in her hand, her expression one of grim determination. She was already starting the repairs. "They think this will make us run," she said, her voice laced with an anger he hadn't heard before. "Maybe we should," Silas admitted, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. "This is my fight. I dragged you into it." She stopped her work and looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "No," she said firmly. "This fight found me long before you did." That night, unable to sleep, Silas sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the stars. A faint light glowed from the single window. He moved quietly to the side of the cabin and peered through a crack in the boards. Anway was sitting at the small table, the lamp casting a warm circle around her. In her hands was the small, carved wooden bird from the street. She turned it over and over, her thumb tracing its lines as if reading a message only she could understand. Her face was a mask of sorrow, but underneath it, he saw a resolve as hard as the granite hills around them. It was then he understood. She wasn't just grieving a dead husband, she was looking for justice. And whatever secret she held, it was dangerous enough to make a man like Sterling send his dogs out in the night. The next morning, as they shared a breakfast of coffee and biscuits, Silas put his cup down. "Tell me about your husband," he said gently. "Tell me what really happened." Anway hesitated, her gaze dropping to the wooden bird, which now sat on the table between them. She picked it up, her fingers closing around it. "My husband, Phone, he was a good man. A clever man. He was a surveyor for the railroad, mapping the new line through these hills." She took a deep breath. "He did not die in a cave-in. That was a lie to cover what they did. He found something. Mr. Sterling's mine, the one that produces so much silver, is on land that was supposed to belong to the railroad. But the claim markers were moved. Phone found the original survey maps, the real ones. He saw the fraud. The silver vein, the richest part of it, wasn't on Sterling's claim at all. It was on public land, designated for the homesteaders who would follow the tracks." Silas felt a cold dread spread through him. It was a crime as old as the frontier itself, land fraud, backed by violence. He was going to report it to the U.S. Marshal, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "He told me he had proof. a signed affidavit from another surveyor who was scared to speak up, along with the true maps. He hid them. He told me that if anything happened to him, this bird would show me the way. She looked at the carving in her hand. It was a signal between us. A way of marking a place. But I do not know how to read it. Now everything made sense. Brody wanting her out of town, the warnings, the vandalism. Sterling wasn't just worried she knew something, he was terrified she could find the evidence that would ruin him and send him to prison. As if summoned by the thought, the sound of hoofbeats echoed down the valley. 2 riders were approaching, moving at a confident, unhurried pace. Silas recognized the man in the lead instantly from his portraits in the town paper. He was handsome and impeccably dressed, a stark contrast to the rugged landscape. It was Jedediah Sterling. The man with him was one of Brody's deputies. Silas stood up, moving to block the cabin door. "Stay inside," he murmured to Anway. Sterling reined in his horse a few yards away, a pleasant, easy smile on his face. It was the kind of smile that didn't touch the eyes. "Mr. Blackwood, I presume," he said, his voice smooth as polished wood. "Jedediah Sterling. I heard you'd taken on some help. A commendable act of charity." "She earns her wage," Silas said flatly. Sterling's smile widened. "Of course. I've been meaning to come out and see your claim. You've chosen a fine spot. A bit dry, perhaps, but it has potential." He paused, letting his gaze drift over the meager homestead. "Though perhaps not enough potential for a man of your ambition. I'm prepared to make you an offer. I'll buy your claim. $500. Cash." It was an absurdly generous offer, more than the hardscrabble piece of land would be worth in 10 years. It was not a business proposition. It was a threat, wrapped in currency. Take the money and disappear. Silas thought of Anway inside the cabin, of the story she had just told him. He thought of her husband, murdered for his integrity. $500 was a fortune. It was a ticket out, a chance to start over somewhere else, free of this danger. All he had to do was say yes. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Sterling," Silas said, his voice steady. "But the claim's not for sale." Sterling's smile finally vanished. His eyes went cold and hard. "I advise you to reconsider, Mr. Blackwood. This valley has a way of being inhospitable to men who don't know what's good for them. Fences break. Wells run dry. Sometimes, people just get lost." The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare in the afternoon sun. Silas felt the weight of his choice settle on him. This was the moment of turning, the point from which there was no going back. He had stood up for a stranger in a saloon. Now he was being asked to risk his life for her. "I'll take my chances," Silas said. Sterling stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to his deputy. Without another word, he wheeled his horse around and rode away. Silas stood watching until they were out of sight, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just declared war on the most powerful man in the county. He turned and went back inside the cabin. Anway was standing by the window, her face pale. She was holding out a piece of worn, folded paper. It was the one he'd seen her retrieve from the dust in the street. "It is a letter from Phone," she said, her hand shaking. "The last one he wrote me. I did not understand it before. But now," she unfolded it. "He wrote that if anything happened, the proof was hidden where the hawk watches the sun rise." Silas looked at her, then through the open doorway toward the eastern ridge. He had looked at that ridge 1,000 times. Near the crest was a peculiar rock formation, a granite outcropping that, from this angle, looked exactly like a hawk in profile, its stony beak pointed toward the dawn sky. "I know the place," he said, a surge of adrenaline cutting through his fear. They didn't wait. They saddled his horse and rode toward the ridge, the sun beginning its descent behind them. The climb was steep and treacherous. As they neared the rock formation, Silas saw it, a narrow fissure at the base of the hawk, concealed by a thick growth of sagebrush. He reached inside and his fingers brushed against cold metal. It was a small lockbox. Just as he pulled it free, a voice rang out from below. "Hold it right there, Blackwood." Sheriff Brody and two of Sterling's men stood at the bottom of the slope, their rifles leveled. They had been followed. "Put the box down." "Nice and slow," Brody commanded. Silas looked at Anway. Her face was grim, but her eyes were defiant. They were trapped. A gunfight here would be suicide. But handing over the box meant Fong's death would mean nothing. It meant Sterling would win. Thinking fast, Silas held the box up. "You're too late, Brody," he bluffed, his voice carrying down the ridge. "I found this yesterday. A copy of everything inside is already on its way to the territorial capital in Carson City. The U.S. Marshal is due in town tomorrow. You kill us, you'll be the first person he questions. Sterling will hang." Brody hesitated. The lie was plausible enough to give him pause. He looked at his men, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. In that moment of hesitation, the sound of a single horse, ridden hard, reached them from the valley floor. A lone rider was approaching on the main trail. He wore the duster of a lawman and rode with an unmistakable air of authority. It was the marshal, a day early. Brody's face fell. The game was up. He and his men lowered their rifles, their bluff called by a truth more potent than any lie Silas could invent. 3 months later, the autumn sun cast a golden light over the small valley. The homestead was transformed. A new, sturdy porch wrapped around the front of the cabin. A stone-lined well stood where the tip barrel had once been, and a small, flourishing garden produced late-season squash and beans. The claim next to Silas's, the one that held the true silver vein, now belonged to Anway, awarded to her by a federal judge as restitution and as Fong's rightful heir. Jedediah Sterling and Sheriff Brody were awaiting trial. The town of Redemption Gulch had changed, too. Fear had been replaced by a grudging respect. Mr. Gable now extended them unlimited credit at the general store. Folks who had once looked through them now nodded as they passed in the street. Silas was hammering the last board onto the porch railing when Anway came out of the cabin, carrying a dipper of cool water. She wore a simple dress of blue calico, but as she drew closer, he saw a small patch on the sleeve of his worn work shirt. It was a perfect square of faded pink fabric, cut from the tattered dress she had worn that first day. She had used it to mend a tear, placing it right over his heart. He stopped his hammering and took the dipper, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. He looked from the patch to her face. Her eyes held a quiet warmth that had slowly, over weeks of shared work and shared danger, replaced the fear he had first seen in them. No grand words of love had been spoken. They had not been needed. Their feelings had been built slowly, board by board, stone by stone, like the home they now shared. He touched the pink patch on his shirt. "You saved this," he said, his voice a little rough. "Nothing worth keeping should be thrown away," she replied softly. In a land that prized loud strength and quick fortunes, they had found something quieter and more durable. They had discovered their courage not in a gunfight, but in the simple, profound act of standing for one another when no one else would. And in a place called Redemption Gulch, that had been more than enough to build a life. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.